that last piece was called Dixie Downbeat. Anybody guess who's sorry now? Yeah. I'm sure you'll recognize the next one. That one was Wabash Blues. This next piece is sort of our signature song. Not that we play it any better than the other ones, but it's High Society. It's a fairly famous piece. Hope you like it. So I am thrilled to be able to have our group play tonight. I look forward to our rehearsals all the time. COVID has put a damper on it, but it's been nice that our numbers have gone down, so we've been able to get back together and practice again and to play for you tonight. I am not usually the front man of the group. I'm just one of the guys, but since, you know, it's International Keith Day, they let me stand up front. But I'm going to introduce John, who's going to introduce the band.
It's a real pleasure to be here, so thank you very much. And so, we'll use the microphone. So, yes, so introducing the band. I'm a retired surgeon from the Minneapolis VA, so this has been a lifelong dream of mine to put together a Dixieland band. So I'm very pleased to be with these guys, and they are all fantastic musicians. So we obviously know Keith Williams, and so he's our clarinetist, and not tonight, all saxophones. He plays them all. And so over there on the flugelhorn and cornet is Steve Dix, Back there on the tuba, that's Rolf Westby. On drums, we have Steve Eckes, who is the leader of the Wastebasket Review that's up in Park Center, yeah. And so on keys over here, we have G.R. Svendal, who plays gigs all around town. Steve Shelly here on trumpet, and my name is John Clark. So.
If you're wondering about any of the names, just guess Steve.
You got Steve C, Steve D, and Steve E.
Yeah. Here we go. Fidgety feet.
Okay,
Fidgety feet. Okay, ready to go. So thanks for all being here. That was Fidgety Feet, as you heard us discussing up front. Fun little piece. The next one is as an old standard. Everybody knows it, Basin Street Blues with John on vocals. No pressure, John.
No pressure. Got it.
Oh, 1, 2, 3.
Another hand for John Clark, please. Nicely done.
Thank you.
A couple of interesting settings coming up, and I know you'll recognize the next one. Dynamite arrangement by Canadian Brass. Got one more of those coming. Yeah. And very famous trombone player by the name of Kid Ory has been featured on the jazz station a couple of times just this week. And we've got a nice piece coming up that Kid Ory used to play a lot of. Yeah. That was Muskrat Ramble. I had to read it, Muskrat Ramble. I've got things in my mind. Go figure. We've just got one piece left. Hope you enjoy it.
And you'll probably recognize it.
I think
you will.
It depends on how well I play.
You'll be amazing, that's right.
Well, that was fun for me. We'll see you at 7.
Good evening. I see Keith is here, so I think it's safe to stay. Welcome, both those of you who are here in the Youth Auditorium and those of you who are joining us online. My name is Poehler. I'm Dean of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences. And it's my honor to welcome you to the 19th Poehler Lecture. It's been 20 years since our first, but as has been the case with so many things in 2020, Concordia made the difficult but necessary decision to close its campus and move classes completely online just days before last year's lecture was to occur. And so our distinguished guest this evening is in the unique position of preparing one address, then living through a pandemic, significant global social upheaval related to the killing of George Floyd and heightened awareness of the deaths of so many other unarmed people of color, and the first occasion in which this country did not enjoy a peaceful transition of power after the most hotly contested election in U.S. presidential history. As a result, we will be hearing something very different tonight than we would have 1 year ago. At Concordia, we dedicate ourselves to and prepare our students for thoughtful and informed living, dedicated service to God and humanity, and enlightened care of God's creation, all in the context of the Christian gospel. This lecture is an annual reminder and embodiment of that mission, and honors the Reverend Dr. William August Poehler, Concordia's third president, who served with great distinction for almost 25 years. It asks senior members of our faculty to reflect on their faith and its relationship to their academic disciplines and their lives. While I wish tonight's event could be conducted before what I believe would have been a full house of appreciative guests, I'm nonetheless grateful that we don't have to wait another year to listen to what I'm sure will be an engaging and thought-provoking presentation. Once our honored speaker has concluded his address and answered a few questions, our president, the Reverend Dr. Brian Friedrich, will share a few remarks and make a presentation to Professor Williams before leading us in a closing prayer. With thanks for those who inspired this lecture, those who have supported it, and those who have spoken to us over the last 20 years, I invite you to join me in prayer. Lord God, Heavenly Father, in this season of Lent, we are reminded of your Son and the suffering he endured so that we would be reconciled to you. In this place dedicated to the cultivation of wise, faithful, compassionate servants, may we be ever mindful of both the cost and the power of Christ's redeeming work in our lives. And may we bring our faith and our intellect, both gracious gifts from you, to the task of serving you and loving our neighbors, all our neighbors, as ourselves. In the name of Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. At this time, I invite Ms. Shelly Schwalm, University Ministry Associate and proud two-time Concordia graduate, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Paul. Good evening. My name is Shelly Schwalm. I serve as University Ministry Associate here at Concordia St. Paul, as well as Paul mentioned, being a double alum, first of the Director of Christian Education program, and more recently an M.F.A. in creative writing. I tell you this to say that there are some people at Concordia who have known me since I was a 19-year-old freshman. And Professor Keith Williams is one of them. Keith was my very first college professor, teaching my first year seminar class with the interesting topic of humor in society. Freshman Shelly thought it was so cool that we got to watch The Daily Show for our homework. And though I didn't study art throughout my time at CSP, my connection with Keith has always been a significant one, filled with the best things: humor, Jesus, and art. The makings of a whimsical and beautiful equation. Just before the pandemic began, Keith took me along to Mexico as the second advisor for the study abroad trip to explore art history and social justice. I was game for an adventure, and at the first mention of Quetzalcoatl, I knew I was totally out of my depth. Though now his colleague, I found myself once again a student of Keith and his students. And as we wandered at Teotihuacan and the breathtaking murals around the campus of the National Autonomous University of Mexico, Keith had us take in the beauty and significance while doing our best not to disrupt it. His favorite admonishment was, be as subtle as the bee in subtle. After all, Keith had often said it is better to be interested than interesting. We stopped many times a day to be really interested and draw what we were seeing. I clumsily sketched along too. Museums, the vivaciously hued homes, the triumph and the struggles of the Mexican people. In the evenings, gathered in the lounge, we'd sit and share stories from the day's adventures, conversations that meandered from beauty to God, to poetry, to pain and injustice, and often back to God and beauty again. While we talked and shared our sketches, I began to notice something. That weaved among Keith's sketches of churches and sites each day were sketches of our group. He subtly would show the featured travelers the sketch that he had captured of them as they soaked in Frida Kahlo's house or caught some winks on the train. In our brief visit to Mexico that was teeming with well-known murals and pyramids, it was his students that Keith saw most worthy of interest. While his eyes have set on some of the most world-renowned pieces of art, and his hands have sculpted magnificent works of his own, the students in Professor Williams' care are the masterpieces for which he never lacks curiosity or wonder. The very best teachers come to learn. One's understanding of their discipline is only as helpful as one's willingness to understand their students. He seems to never lack interest for either. When I first went from student to staff, I remember telling Keith I was worried I would be seen as unproductive, with little to show for time spent simply being present with students. He assured me that my unproductivity was the most effective way to have room to be interested in order to meet the needs of students. I still think of that when my weeks feel just a little bit more productive and helpful. You demonstrate the value of serving students and neighbors through generous attentiveness and curiosity. Keith is one of the most iconic people at CSP. I seriously considered wearing my funkiest hat and sewing a mustache on my mask this evening, but that would have been breaking the rule of being as subtle as the being subtle. Yet it is only a smidge of the evidence, though, that in the quest to be interested or interesting, Professor Williams, you have certainly arrived at both. As you have offered your interest to so many of us, we are fortunate to return the favor this evening, with no doubt that you will be most interesting. So it is an honor and a joy to invite this year's Poehler lecturer, Keith Williams, to the stage a year later than expected. We await interested.
I won't be able to see if I fall down. I'd like to thank the committee for inviting me to present last year. As Paul said, the pandemic and all the subsequent events of 2020 have completely altered all of the thoughts that I had had over the years of what I would present if I had been asked to do so. So here in 2021, I'm grateful for this interrupted opportunity. This challenging and painful year has itself become my teacher. It has encouraged me to better understand the real teaching of my life. My wife, Kristen, who loves justice, has been one of my life's real mentors. She introduced me to Michael Johnson's version of this song about teaching and education. You have got to be taught to hate and fear, day after day, year after year. It's got to be drummed in your dear little ear. You've got to be carefully taught to hate and fear. You have got to be taught before it's too late, before you are 6 or 7 or 8. To hate all the people your relatives hate. You've got to be carefully taught. In struggling how to reframe my presentation, I realized in a brief exchange with my pastor, Ali Tranvik, that my 2021 worldview is the world reflected backwards and broken. It's a broken mirror, fragmented and reversed from my youthful expectations of what life would be. So the disorganizational structure of this presentation, without segues, will echo this insight, this brokenness. I hope perceptions of real teachers and teaching emerges from this abstracted form of a speech. My artist friend Frank J. Brown, who did not survive the pandemic, was riding with me as I drove. Frank had incredible charisma and joy and faith. And on that faith, he chose to make a living as a studio artist after getting his M.F.A. in ceramics. And he did so for over 2 decades. Mostly it worked, with some help. But income was uneven, and the last year of his life he was homeless. Time spent with Frank was an education. As we drove along that one day, he abruptly turned to me and asked, "What are you doing?" And I said, "What?" And he told me that I had changed lanes in the middle of an intersection. And I said, "Yeah." And then he gave me that look of, "Oh, I guess you get to do that." It was one of the dozens of lessons that only Frank could teach me. By that time in his life, Frank had been arrested 17 times for living while black, he would say. Each time the charges had been dropped. You see, Frank's life learnings and mine were not the same. The rules that applied to him were different too. I rarely pray in words, especially when I'm alone. I've grown cautious of defining matters of faith into words. As much as I love theology, I am often clever with language and am wary of convincing myself that I have some sort of understanding when I merely have my own perceptions. I hope my words do help others learn or in their spiritual searches. But for me, if my head is filled with words, I am far, far from feeling spiritual, present, or connected. My best prayers are in the time collaborating musically by listening more than thinking, or time with hands in clay, with a quiet mind in the studio, or time feeling my feet touching Creator when I walk, or perhaps time spent nurturing kindness when I can. All thoughts tonight are not original to me, yet somehow they are mine now. I suspect my greatest skill as a teacher is taking time to listen and learn from others. I mostly remind students of what they already know, and I call it teaching. Most teachers can only hope to present ideas in a way that refresh old meanings and connect knowledge in new ways with their students. And this can only happen when the students are ready. Don Wrights, my play professor, and later my friend, taught through story. Once I heard Don's father teaching through Don's voice. While opening the hole in his pot, he said, "My pop told me all great human achievements start with a hole." He continued on with his father's lessons, but I wandered off in my own mind, sitting there in my seat. I thought, yes, if you need water, you dig a well. If you need a building, you dig a foundation. You need a tree, dig a nest to plant the seed. If you need metals or clay, you mine the earth. Professors' assignments are nothing but holes for students to fill as best they can, but them also to continue on to finding their own new knowledge. The holes we make create futures. I once made the mistake of saying I'm not a theologian and was reminded that we're all theologians. I'm about to make the mistake of saying I'm not a poet, but I do write poems. This is the first time I've ever read my poems in public. Remarkable marks expression itself. Clay's perfect skin receives each personal stroke. The clay speaks back. Not laying on surface, but drawn deep inside. Drawn from within. Journey through drawn surfaces. Find pure expression. Find personal needs. Material and maker united, apart from all else. Expression itself. Remarkable marks worth remarking. Creativity through time. Capture. Part maker, not clay. I listened to a conference presentation at my professional organization in order to learn from a First Nation potter and an elder from the Southwest through a presenter who had gone to visit her. His grant had connected him with this woman who showed him her traditional practices. He asked if she would do a traditional firing for him. And so she said yes and told him where and what day to meet. Now, when you fire pots, you have to fire them very slowly to help the clay adjust to the flame that's going to create its new life. Knowing this, she told him when to arrive. Come before the wind blows. For potters, that way we would know that the flame wouldn't kick up too fast. He drove off only to realize he had no idea what time that was. There was no wind blows on his watch. He thought it through, though, and concluded that this must be before sunrise, before the heat convections create the wind. She was already there when he arrived. She lived on nature's time. His watch did not reflect her world. Her culture knew time long before his culture imposed numbers onto it. Nature's time is rooted in real understanding, not numbers. He left, before he left, he wanted to help her dig some clay. And since her aged body couldn't carry a lot of clay, at home anymore. So he drove her to the clay deposit that her village had used for generations, and wanting to fill his trunk so she could continue making pots. Before they dug the hole, though, she asked him to wait and to stand at a distance. And she knelt on the clay. And she sprinkled an offering of corn onto the ground. She thanked Mother Earth quietly in her own language, saying words of gratitude in her own tongue. She took time to be thankful for that hole they were about to dig. Time ceased to matter. She was thankful for a hole. Another poem. This one's about clay, surprise. I wrote it for an Ansica conference exhibition that was entitled Push Play. And the curator of the exhibition asked me to write a creative entry for the catalog. This is what came out. Push clay, pug, pull, produce, push boundaries. Clay smells and sounds in the studio, pushes senses. Sight, thought, and touch too, push buttons. Push the limits of limitless pursuits. Put your stamp on, not mailing it in. Push the envelope. Envelop the push in creative energy. Find edges and push back. Prod, penetrate, poke, and push people. Push yourself, push. Massive and malleable clay molds to the will, clay molds the will. Subtle, satisfying shifts from leather to bone, unachievable once fired. Collaborating with artist and fire, clay, real, corporal. Play. Play with the clay.
stay late and play all day. Along the way, weigh the play. Choose the way to say what's next. Play your hand across the clay. Let what may play out. Options play against each other. Yea and nay, the creative way. Wordplay. Colorful display, forms, figures, concepts on stage. Ply the trade, the craft of clay. Play the clay today. Play. St. Augustine Brooke. A couple of years back, a student, Brooke, asked, Keith, have you ever thought about what time is? She acknowledged that it was a weird question. I was a little stunned and secretly pleased that she thought I might have some insights. She didn't know, and I didn't know it then, that she was echoing St. Augustine from the 4th century, who wrote, "If nobody asks me what is time, I know, but if I desire to explain it, should somebody ask, I plainly do not know." Ironically, I asked her to give me some time to consider the topic. A couple of weeks or months later, I lose track of time, I told her that I had my thoughts ready. I intellectualized for her about how time seemed to be a human construct. My physicist father might have taken exception to this. I remember his enthusiasm in the 1960s for the atomic clock and how accurately it was able to measure time. I added a short take on Einstein's theory of relativity and gravity wells and traveling near the speed of light, yada, 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 right? It was mostly a smokescreen. She might have bought it, I think. What matters, though, is that she pushed me to new thoughts. Spending time with students like Brooke becomes our teacher. Those times remind me to be a mentor instead of a professor. We mentor through a slow, inefficient, time-bound relationship that benefits both parties. When we try to profess, our desire to efficiently deliver content limits us. Rushing on to be on time, blazing past life, but on time for what's next. Arriving on time, wait for a time when others not on time. Spending time, wasting time, planning better ways to be on time. If behind time, time sprints to prevent on time. Ahead of time, time crawls with judgment of those not on time. On time, cancer of my mind, robbing me blind of my own self in time. I don't mind if I'm on time. On time, not behind, sublime fiction, a lying timeline. On time, life goal. So late is not my fate. On time, for some future time, my stone will simply say, so sorry I'm late. Can I get a rim shot? I am slowly grasping the deceit of Western linear time. Most traditional cultures view time as cyclical. They see the folly of living life while driven by time. I try to let go of that terrible tyranny only when I'm intentionally aiming at my real values, unfortunately. Chris, my wife, has a great passion for Native American cultures and cultural values. She reads and shares a great deal with me. In 2 books she recently shared called Neither Wolf Nor Dog and its sequel, The Wolf at Twilight by Kent Nerburn, I was helped in my deeper dive into understanding First Nations' sense of time and place. Dan, the nearly blind elder in the books, whose Western education simply tried to remove the Indian from him, teaches Nerburn that nature's time simply by the way he moves through life. He reminds the author that naming a year by its significant weather event is just as much history as applying a number like 1492. And perhaps it's even a better historical marker than a number. Nerburn learns that children and elders are the closest to each other in the cycle of time. The young have just emerged from the great mystery. The elders are laying cozy. Dan also reminded Nerburn of his own cultural truths, of Western truths, but through a native lens. That true wealth is in what you give away, not what you possess. That Jesus taught sharing instead of keeping and protecting what is ours. He laments that Nerburn's culture, my culture, only teaches children that sharing is a good thing, but that it is taught as a small side branch, not as the trunk of the tree of life. You see, sharing completes our lifetimes. I have learned that truths, real truth and wisdom, are found in all cultures, all religions, and all individuals. Real teachers are everywhere, and I am diminished if I don't take time to listen, or worse, if I don't think I need to. We miss understanding our own cultural truths if we don't share as equals. A former student taught me that it is better to be interested than interesting. I have stolen that phrase and used it many, many times. The word for person in Japanese, ninja, it reflects both identity and also interaction. Nin simply means human being, but gen stands for space. A type of in-betweenness between individuals. The concept of a person can't simply be autonomous and distinct. The concept of a person is based on connections and interrelationships of that person in space, in time. In Japan, myself is in large part my space meeting your space in time. My self-interest is dependent on the self-interest of you. Years ago, I was leading a group through Mexican Potter's Village of Arizona in the southern state of Oaxaca. We were to experience ceramic traditions there and to talk about the economic realities of being a traditional craftsperson in an impoverished Mexican state. Senora Enadina, who lived in a house with a dirt floor, made pots and cared for her aged mother, who was mostly blind. They were both barefoot although only Aunt Adina sat with us on the ground to work in the traditional way. My friend Aunt Adina has an engaging edge. While demonstrating, she gave me some of her clay and challenged me to make something. Her clay was impolite. It was sticky and wet and profoundly different than any clay I've ever touched in my life. And she probably knew that. I took time and slowly figured out how to listen to its voice, and I ended up making a creditable pot. Up there. She seemed surprised at my success, but her words were translated as, "Not bad. You'd make a good Mexican woman someday." But the story I really wanted to tell about that visit was from our walk to her home. Our group walked through the rutted streets of her poor village, and as we trooped along, a shepherd's flock merged in front of us from a side street. I couldn't remember ever seeing an actual shepherd at work before. He followed the flock with a long, flexible stick. Mostly he watched and listened. The flock jostled and flowed around, opened and closed their ranks on their own. From time to time, from his lifetime of watching those sheep, he knew when one edged away that he could just do a gentle little tap on a heel, and it would snap back in. It was the single best lesson in leadership I have ever had. Quietly pay attention from behind. Limit the desire to control everything and to guide only when necessary. Trust that the group is safer, smarter, and better simply by spending time together. Incidentally, Aunt Adina also held up a unique mirror to my ego. I mentioned her friendly edge. Well, you see, she had probably not advanced beyond the 3rd or 4th grade in her education, but she was a respected potter and had been hired to teach pottery at the university in Oaxaca City. During our visit, she very intentionally reminded me that she was a professor, my colleague, my equal. Her truth radically altered my perspective of myself. I was embarrassed that although I knew those facts, I had to be told and reminded of our equality. I had to be told. Shouldn't everybody be seen as our equal? Mirror me roar. Helps bound in spell, my gaze inspects myself. Indelible wrinkles, thinning skin slink slowly in. Wispy locks, covered. And dancing graying diversion, displayed over lip, I become myself. Reflected ego, all cleverness and wit. Unreflected is knowledge, my wisdom is borrowed. Unexpected teachers teach all. My flat silver self continues and alters its haunted habits. Sheer veils of deception and truth silently shatter. Self alone is mere illusion. Dependent self, the reality of the visage. Spellbound in spell. My gaze inspects my knowing self. Mirror, my roar. I used to think that my best course evaluations read, "This course was too much work. I learned a lot." Yes, nailing those rubrics. I recently got this anonymous Courcedale comment, quote, "I, for one, am not a very religious individual beyond believing, but I do believe that the instructor, and not the class, made a difference in my own personal life going forward by improving my outlook on patience and empathy and understanding in my other areas of study." And all that time, I thought I was teaching clay. A Chinese proverb tells of two lumbermen eating lunch beneath a gnarled old tree. The younger woodcutter lamented to the elder that it was unfortunate that this tree was so bent as to be useless at the mill. The elder woodsman simply replied that if the tree had been straight and tall, that it would have been felled, and we would have no shade for sitting while eating our lunch together. All things have their voice if we listen. A woodsman sharing space and time, and insight becomes the real teacher. I never expected a learning moment in my little Honda CRX on an August morning in 2002. I was driving to Atlanta to help plan an ELCA National Youth Gathering and to check out, frankly, a new job in Little Rock, Arkansas. My bag in the back, I eased into the cold morning. I'd forgotten my CDs back in the day. And so I was just planning on coming here to get them, and then I'd take I-35 east, south, instead of west. At that ramp, at 4:30 in the morning, was a bundled, indistinct mountain of a man. His breath was visible, even in the dark, near his old scarf. His outstretched thumb was exposed. I found myself stopping without a thought. He stiffly folded his heavy 6'6" into my low two-seater, and he thanked me, explaining that he had been there freezing for over 2 hours. Homeless, he had not slept as the St. Paul police kept moving him along. He was headed to LA. I told him I'd take him as far south as he wanted to go. He asked if he could sleep and was out quickly. I savored driving in that indigo silence until northern Iowa's sunrise awakened him. Lawson introduced himself, and when I asked, he admitted that he was hungry, but also that he had only $7 and some change. We stopped and I treated us both to fast food, some treat. I suggested perhaps some music, and he was eager to look at my selections. And I was surprised that he knew every one of my vintage jazz selections. We talked about music, and eventually about why we were on the road. I talked about the planning meeting, and about leaving CSP because they had just released my colleague Carla. I felt betrayed and angry. I worried that my program would crumble and that no one but me cared. I was pretty self-absorbed. I went on to tell him that the job in Little Rock was a good job. I had a good chance at it, but there would be family complexities if we moved. I told him how much I would miss my church choir. He listened quietly, helping me realize that I was doing all the talking. So I asked him how he knew my music. And it turned out that Lawson knew jazz because he had been a cab driver in Newport, Rhode Island, which hosts an international jazz festival every year. And my favorite musicians had ridden in his cab. And we exchanged jazz names and jazz stories and enjoyed finding our common ground. but he then took the risk of sharing more of himself. He talked about how he had stupidly lost his cab license because he had hit an emergency vehicle on a call, on a response. The consequence was automatic, and he fell into a self-incriminating silence. I waited and finally asked for a little bit more of his story. He had come to the Midwest to find a Vietnam buddy who lived in Baraboo, he thought, but he had no luck finding him there. He had heard good things about St. Paul and Minneapolis, so he thumbed up here, but the St. Paul police changed his attitude. His frigid night had continued a long string of hard times. First, he had lost his father some years earlier to a long and painful cancer bout. His mother was living in poverty in Georgia. They hadn't talked in years. He had lost his wife through a tough divorce. He was estranged from his daughter, and he wondered if his wife had turned her against him, but he knew otherwise. Recently, he himself had been diagnosed with his father's cancer. Without treatment, he too would die. My life perspective shifted. Compared with Lawson's, my anger was tiny. Listening to him, I knew I didn't need a new job. With that said, in my head, he continued on about feeling deeply alone, without his non-buddy, his family, his job, his future. His logical conclusion was to simply go to LA where he knew no one and to die. Anonymously. Just disappear. I'm usually one with advice, but instead I just nodded and waited. And I asked about his God. He continued entrusting his entire life to that little space and that little time we shared. He knew it was not a pretty life. I knew Lawson's darkest self. I understood his logic. What more had he to lose? As we neared Des Moines, I noted that he could head west on I-80, but I invited him to continue with me to Kansas City, and he could take I-70 west before I-80 east. His story continued to new music that we put in. He had smoked his entire life. He had drank heavily and overate. He ruined his body. He had cheated on his wife multiple times, sometimes with multiple partners. He had made some terrible choices as a parent. He had been a regular drug user, and he had even dealt. I didn't know his past. I didn't know his pain, or what he left behind in Vietnam. Any judgment from me would be of no help. I just stayed quiet. Mostly people just need to tell their stories to an understanding ear. I listened for 3 more hours. It was pretty ugly stuff. He concluded that his lifetime was a series of poor choices. He was pained. After a little bit of silence, but still north of Kansas City, I made Lawson an offer. I asked him if perhaps he would consider traveling with me east to Georgia. I told him I welcomed his company. I put him up in a hotel in Little Rock. I suggested that he might want to say goodbye to his mom, and that she might want to know. His answer wasn't immediate, but we apparently did have more to share. Our conversation on the second day was mostly light, now and again, though we did touch philosophy and worldviews and life. His mother's trailer home was 2 hours south of Atlanta, where I was going. Struggling out of the passenger seat, Lawson thanked me. I watched their unexpected meeting at her door. A time in my life I would never forget ended as I backed out, now woefully late for my meetings in Atlanta. Lawson became a long entry in my schedule the next morning. Months later, though, Chris answered Lawson's phone call. I wasn't home. He had returned to Rhode Island. He got his job back, sought treatment for his cancer, and he asked his daughter's forgiveness, which she gave. He was thankful. Through Chris, he thanked me for not being the judgmental Christian that lived in his head. The time with Lawson taught me, over time, that I could find the sacred by creating safe silence. God's voice can be heard by sincerely listening, without judgment, to those most broken among us. Those 2 days' time taught me that an aging Honda, too small to hold 2 people in comfort, could become a temple. I never really successfully connected back with Lawson, though I tried. He's floated into my mind over the years. I thought I'd spend a little bit of time with the clay, because this seemingly inanimate stuff has been a teacher too. Little prep, sorry. I've been working with clay for a long, long time, since high school. In order to make a good pot, you need to center the clay. Many potters over the years have also realized that this is a life lesson. When you spend a lot of quiet time in the studio, you get to thinking, if you're not listening to NPR, by taking the clay and putting it into the center of the wheel, finding the right breath to do that, we find out that the clay is centering us at the same time. That's a line that I got from a couple of clay masters. Nothing tonight is original. And the clay is in the center. As a It's full of potential. But the only way for the clay to be useful, to become what it might become, it has to take a posture of openness. I think about holes more than most people do. That posture of openness and the nature of clay is that it wants to be stretched. It also wants to obey gravity, not necessarily our friend. It's only by stretching that it can grow. This is not a political statement. You can't be conservative. You can't be satisfied with being the same. It has to take risks in order to become something new, to enter the world in a new life. It has to be able to collaborate with me, the potter, with the wheel, with the water. It has to be willing to stretch. As a potter, I need skill and technique to be successful. But I also need to be able to listen to what this particular ball of clay at this particular time is saying that it can do, that it can't do. I can't just impose my will. There's that familiar hymn about you are the potter, I am the clay, mold me, shape me. Whenever I present at church from the potter's wheel, that hymn shows up. But I struggle with its theology because the clay is shaping me, the creator, as much as I'm shaping it, the clay. It takes more time. It's taken years, lifetime, for the clay to shape me, for me to be open, to stretch. But my time with the clay has done that. It's helped me find pace. It's helped me to remember to breathe. Some of my clay students have heard me tell the story that when I was in graduate school, one of the professors was walking past me doing a pull on a very large pot, and I was holding my breath, and he said, "Williams, you know you can breathe, don't you?" No, nobody had ever told me that. It made me a better potter. Finding my breath, finding my pace, listening to what the clay can and can't do. So I start off with a general idea of what I want to make, not a specific one. I don't have a pot in mind. I have a category of pots in mind. And from that point, as an artist, I get to listen to the clay and make the pot that this clay wants to be, based on whether it's wet clay or dry clay. Stretchable or short. I could never do this with Anandina's clay. That clay is only for hand building. It wouldn't throw at all. Each clay has new things to teach. If the potter is able to listen. And all potters do. Sometimes the potters have ideas, they have things that they need to sell, things that they need to make, and they know what works. And that's fine. And what I have found as a university professor is I have been freed to not make production work that dictates to me what it needs to be. Rather, I can form this ongoing conversation from my time with clay. This pot has been stretched, moved, and is now ready for another roll. In time, it will be ready for a handle, but it's too soft now. If I attach a handle, the pot will warp, the handle will fall. Clay tells the potter when it's ready. I tell my students, I live on clay standard time. My wife doesn't always appreciate that. This piece here I started a little while ago. It became an educational process for my drawing class today. Didn't expect for that to happen. I had the idea on Saturday. But I spent time working on this class while my figure drawing class was drawing me as the model, moving through time, interacting with the piece. But the piece needs handles. And so I'm stretching the clay into handles for this piece. I'm only going to attach one right now. To decide where on this piece that it wants to be, and I think it's here. So, for the epilogue, closing in on the end here. In the Velveteen Rabbit by Marjorie Williams and illustrated by William Nicholson. Meaning. And then here we are. There. In the Velveteen Rabbit, it was the old wise skin horse, the village elder who understood the nature of real education. What is real? Asked the Velveteen Rabbit. Does it mean having things that buzz inside you and a stick-out handle? Real isn't how you were made, said the skin horse. It's a thing that happens to you when someone loves you for a long, long time. It's not just to play with, but really loves you. Then you become real. Does it hurt? Said the rabbit. Sometimes, said the skin horse, for he was always truthful. But when you're real, you don't mind. Does it happen all at once, like being wound up? He asked, or bit by bit. It doesn't happen all at once, said the skin horse. You become. It takes a long time. That's why it doesn't often happen to people who break easily, or have sharp edges, or have to be carefully kept. Generally, by the time you're real, most of your hair has been lopped off, and your eyes drop out, and you get loose in your joints, and very shabby. But these things don't matter at all, because once you are real, you can't be ugly, except to people who don't understand. Real ceramic art comes from developing a long, slow, honest, and thankful relationship with the clay. In art and life, the voice of the earth should be honored. Teaching real is taking the time to honor all people's cultural knowledge and story, all people's. Role modeling honest, lifelong learning. Teaching real is taking slow time to listen to the needs of our students. It's reminding them of what they already know and helping them to make new connections to truth. Teaching real is also learning from them and having the faith that time teaches best. I'd love to take a question or two. If you have any thoughts, you can just speak them and I'll repeat them into the microphone so that folks can hear. Any questions? Any thoughts? Any ideas? Just going to keep on working up here. None? That was it? Yeah.
Yeah, so as one of your students in the past, we talked about in person, but what was your biggest challenge, both at CSP and throughout your life as a teacher?
Biggest challenge as a teacher and in life? Yeah. So I'm going to be personal. I apologize for that. My biggest challenge is my lack of confidence in myself and my need to prove myself, because I have rarely thought that I'm enough. And although I put on a good show as a teacher, got a good teacher mask, I had to seek counseling for self-doubt and depression related to that. So, yeah, I mean, being my real self, giving myself permission to be, okay. That's been my biggest life challenge and teaching challenge. Other questions? Sure, there is more.
Any specific things from your own Christian faith, your background, that have informed you in your very holistic view of teaching and life?
Sure. Well, I hoped that my comments about prayer were a lot of that, but I am not unaware that according to the Bible, I am this stuff and this stuff is me. And one of the things that I've said multiple times in multiple situations is that I don't believe that when it says we're created in God's image that it means God looks like this. I would be really disappointed. But I like to think that we are created as creators, as co-creators, and that is a large part of what it means to be a Christian in the arts, a Christian in education, that I'm creating not only artwork, but relationships with my students. I'm creating memories. I'm creating experiences that I hope are relevant and useful. I don't pray in words. I try to teach as prayer. I try to walk as prayer. I had a pastor who started every prayer in church with the word "and." And I thought about that. I never asked him about it, but what it meant to me was that all of life was prayer. And that anytime we started praying in words, it was just a continuation of that ongoing offering of prayer, of thanks, of supplication, of need, of lament, of joy, of thankfulness. So although I have very universal experiences, my lens is always through that of my Christian and specifically Lutheran faith. Did I repeat the question? I forget if I did that, but I hope I answered it. One last question? Yeah?
Why did you pursue teaching instead of going down the professional route?
So why teach instead of making these for a living? So I learned how to make pottery as a freshman in high school, and I was terrible, really terrible at first. Really terrible at first. But I wanted it so badly that I worked really hard for it, and I got pretty good by the time I was a junior, so much so that I was better than my high school teacher, who was an illustrator. And so she started inviting me to teach her students, the throwing part. And so I would come down in my study halls and I would teach, and I liked that. I liked that a lot. And if you made me choose right now between ever making again or teaching every time. Every time I am to be, I hope, a kind and generous helper of students, colleagues. That's what I aspire to. Yeah. Good question. So I'm thinking this is the lid. And I think that our president has something to say.
Thank you, teacher. Good evening. The one regret I have about this evening is that not more of us can be in person, face to face, coffee cup to coffee cup, cookie to cookie after this event. But we salute you anyway, Keith. As the snow started to fall yesterday afternoon, I said to myself, no, not again. We cannot wait 365 more days. So we are grateful that the snow stopped and the wind stilled.
Oh, the wind was plenty loud.
So it's a wonderful pleasure this evening to celebrate you and to receive the realness of your teaching, your person, your ministry, and your service among us. For those who know you and have served with you well, just seeing the title of your presentation, we knew what to expect, teaching real. For those of us who don't know Keith quite as well, we just experienced real teaching. This evening, Keith, on behalf of the entire CSP community, we acknowledge your long-term, long-time, and significant ministry, service, teaching, and giftedness in this place. We're grateful for you, deeply grateful for you. So thank you, Keith, for honoring us this evening, for again blessing this institution with all of the many gifts God has given you. Again tonight, as you've done countless times before, you've opened our eyes and our minds, our ears and our hearts to the wonders of God's creation and the wisdom of His Word. So thank you. Thank you for passionately, effectively living the promise of CSP, a place where Christ is honored and all are welcome. Keith, on behalf of Concordia University St. Paul, we celebrate you, we recognize you, and we thank you for being our 20th Poehler Lecture Series speaker. Thank you.
Says, in gratitude for your presentation on March 17th, 2020. Well, March 16th, 2021, really.
And now we pray. Gracious Lord, our loving Heavenly Father, we are fearfully and wonderfully made. You have reminded us of that again right well this evening. We thank you that you sent Jesus, your Son, into time, into our time, and that for us, his story, his life, his footsteps, his suffering, his dying, and his rising are ours. Thank you, through him being our shepherd, our teacher, and our redeemer. And through him, thank you for bringing all of your people into relationship with you and one to another. This evening, we give you thanks for Keith Williams, for the way in which your Spirit fills him and flows from him. We ask your continued blessing upon his service in this place, among his family, to his community, through your church, and around your word. We pray these things, celebrating all that has been, all that is, and all that is yet to come in the life of this saint, your servant, our friend, our teacher, our Professor Keith. Forth in your name we go, and all God's people say, Amen. That concludes our time together this evening. I invite you to once more thank Professor Keith Williams.